What if the ego's armor was what kept you from feeling alive? Think about it for a moment. We spend our lives constructing elaborate defenses, carefully crafting our image, avoiding vulnerability, protecting ourselves from criticism, maintaining control. We build walls of achievement, identity, and knowledge to shield us from uncertainty. We develop sophisticated techniques to avoid feeling hurt, rejected, or exposed. And in our culture, we call this strength. We call it maturity. We call it wisdom. But what if this fundamental approach to existence, this continuous self-protection, this persistent self-defense, is actually the very thing preventing us from experiencing life's deepest dimensions? What if the armor we've built to keep suffering out is simultaneously keeping aliveness in? There's a strange paradox that becomes visible when we pay close attention to those rare moments when we feel most fully alive. Think about the times when you felt most present, most connected, most vibrant, perhaps in creative flow, in intimate connection, in sudden beauty, or even in profound crisis. What's striking about these experiences is that they typically occur precisely when our usual self-protective mechanisms temporarily fall away. The artist absorbed in creation stops monitoring how they appear to others. The lover in genuine intimacy drops the careful presentation of self. Even in crisis, when ordinary defenses become irrelevant in the face of immediate necessity, we often experience an unusual clarity and presence. This pattern suggests something remarkable. What if our default mode of continuous self-protection isn't wisdom, but blindness? What if the ego, that construct we so carefully defend, is less our ally than our prison? What if true strength isn't found in better defenses, but in the courage to live without them? This paradox becomes even more intriguing when we observe how different people approach the challenges of existence. Those who focus most intently on protecting themselves, maintaining perfect control, avoiding all vulnerability, defending their image and identity, often appear increasingly rigid, brittle, and disconnected over time. Meanwhile, those who demonstrate a certain yielding quality, an ability to remain open even in difficulty, to adapt rather than resist, to flow rather than freeze, seem to develop a different kind of resilience, one characterized not by impenetrability, but by regenerative capacity. Consider how this pattern manifests in nature itself. The rigid tree that cannot bend breaks in the storm. The flowing water that meets no obstacle with resistance nevertheless reshapes the hardest stone. The flexible grass survives what shatters the brittle branch. Perhaps these aren't merely poetic metaphors, but expressions of a fundamental principle that applies to human consciousness as well. That true strength may lie not in hardened resistance, but in supple engagement. Not in defended separation, but in connected participation. What makes this perspective particularly revolutionary is how radically it contradicts our cultural programming. From earliest childhood, we're taught that maturity means better control, stronger boundaries, more effective self-protection. We learn to measure our development by how successfully we can defend against vulnerability, uncertainty, and limitation. We come to view the ego, our constructed sense of separate self, as our most precious possession, something to be continuously defended and enhanced. But what if this entire framework is precisely backward? What if true maturity involves not stronger boundaries but greater porousness, not better control but deeper surrender, not enhanced separation but more profound connection? What if the path to genuine aliveness requires not the strengthening of ego, but its transcendence? This isn't abstract philosophy, but a practical question with profound implications for how we approach existence. If our usual mode of continuous self-protection is actually limiting our experience of life's depth, then many of our fundamental assumptions about strength, wisdom, and fulfillment require radical reconsideration. One thinker looked deeply into this paradox and emerged with a revolutionary insight: that what we call strength is often weakness in disguise, that our sophisticated self-defenses are actually elaborate prisons, and that genuine freedom requires the courage to stop defending ourselves against life. A philosopher who recognized that the ego, that construct we so carefully protect, isn't our deepest truth, but our fundamental limitation, and that its transcendence represents not loss, but liberation. Have you ever considered that what you're working so hard to defend might be the very thing keeping you from experiencing the freedom you truly seek? There's a curious inconsistency in how we understand strength and freedom that becomes apparent when we examine it closely. Throughout our lives, we're taught that empowerment comes through increasing control over our circumstances, our emotions, our vulnerabilities. We learn that freedom means the ability to assert our will, to resist outside influences, to maintain boundaries. And yet, when we look at our actual experience, we encounter a striking anomaly. The moments of greatest aliveness often occur precisely when we temporarily abandon this controlling stance. Think about the experience of flow that artists, athletes, and creators describe. That state where self-consciousness dissolves, where the boundary between doer and doing fades, where action becomes effortless precisely because the controlling ego steps aside. Or consider moments of genuine connection, where protection of self-image gives way to authentic presence. Even in nature, the experiences that most move us, gazing at stars, standing by the ocean, witnessing natural beauty, typically involve a temporary suspension of our usual self-reference, a letting go of the defended position from which we ordinarily encounter the world. This pattern suggests something profound. What if our conventional understanding of freedom is fundamentally backward? What if true liberation doesn't come from strengthening the ego's position but from temporarily transcending it? What if control, rather than being the path to freedom, is actually its primary obstacle? The anomaly becomes even more striking when we observe how different approaches to adversity play out over time. The person who responds to challenge with rigid resistance, attempting to maintain perfect control, rejecting vulnerability, defending against all threats to their self-image, often becomes increasingly brittle. Their identity hardens into fixed positions that must be continuously maintained. Their experience narrows as more of life's aspects are perceived as potential threats requiring defense. The very mechanisms they've developed to protect freedom ultimately constrain it. Conversely, those who respond to difficulty with a certain yielding quality, accepting rather than resisting, adapting rather than controlling, remaining open even in pain, often develop a different kind of strength. Not the brittle hardness of perfect defense, but the supple resilience that comes from the ability to flow with, rather than against, life's currents. Their experience tends to expand rather than contract, embracing more of existence rather than filtering out what threatens the ego's position. What makes this anomaly particularly revealing is how it contradicts our cultural narratives about development. We typically view maturation as a process of establishing stronger boundaries, more effective control, better protection against vulnerability. Yet the evidence of human experience suggests that the most fully developed individuals are not those with the strongest defenses, but those with the greatest capacity for openness, not those who resist life's challenges, but those who have learned to move with them. This pattern appears across domains, psychological, social, spiritual, creative, suggesting it reflects something fundamental about human consciousness, rather than merely specific contexts. Therapists observe that healing often occurs not through better defenses, but through greater acceptance of what has been defended against. Spiritual traditions across cultures point toward transcendence of separate selfhood rather than its enhancement. Creative breakthroughs typically involve suspension of controlling consciousness rather than its intensification. These diverse manifestations of the same pattern point toward a radical possibility. What if the ego, our constructed sense of separate self that must be continuously defended, isn't our ally in the quest for freedom, but its primary obstacle? What if our sophisticated self-protective mechanisms, rather than securing our liberation, actually prevent us from experiencing the very freedom we seek? This perspective would resolve the paradox of why increased control so often leads to diminished aliveness. If freedom isn't found in the ego's assertion of will, but in temporary transcendence of ego-centered perspective, then the endless project of self-defense doesn't lead toward liberation, but away from it. The walls we build to protect ourselves become the very boundaries of our prison. This insight emerged from the thinking of a philosopher who recognized that conventional understanding of strength, freedom, and selfhood might be fundamentally misguided. He saw that what we call strength is often elaborate compensation for deeper insecurity, that what we call freedom is often sophisticated bondage, and that the self we so carefully defend might be not our deepest truth, but our fundamental limitation. Have you noticed in your own experience how moments of greatest aliveness often occur precisely when you temporarily abandon self-protection? How creative flow, intimate connection, natural beauty, or even crisis can generate a strange freedom that comes not from stronger control, but from momentarily letting go of the controlling position itself. In the summer of 1881, in the small Swiss village of Sils Maria, a solitary figure walks along the shores of Lake Silvaplana. He is 36 years old, plagued by chronic health problems that have forced him to abandon his academic position. His published works have been met with indifference or hostility. He lives in modest boarding houses, moving with the seasons in search of climates that might alleviate his physical suffering. By conventional measures, this is a man who has experienced significant failure, professional rejection, physical limitation, personal isolation. This is Friedrich Nietzsche, and it's here, during his solitary walks in the mountains, that he will experience what he later describes as his most profound philosophical insight, one that would transform his understanding of strength, freedom, and the nature of selfhood. In his autobiography, Ecce Homo, he records this moment with unusual emotional intensity. 6,000 feet beyond man and time. This isn't poetic exaggeration, but precise description of a state of consciousness where the usual boundaries of separate selfhood temporarily dissolved, revealing a perspective beyond the ego's defended position. What prepared Nietzsche for this insight was a unique combination of intellectual background and lived experience. Born in 1844 to a Lutheran pastor in rural Prussia, he grew up immersed in Christian morality, with its emphasis on self-denial as spiritual virtue. His subsequent education led him to classical philology, the study of ancient languages and texts, where he encountered Greek culture before the Socratic turn toward rational self-consciousness, a world that celebrated instinct, embodiment, and ecstatic dissolution of individual identity. But perhaps most significant was his direct experience of physical vulnerability. From his mid-20s onward, Nietzsche suffered from debilitating health problems, severe migraines, digestive distress, partial blindness, that made conventional forms of strength and control impossible for him. These conditions forced him into an unusual relationship with existence. Unable to maintain the illusion of invulnerability that health often permits, he had to discover a different approach to life, one based not on resistance to limitation but on creative engagement with it. This convergence of intellectual background and embodied experience created the conditions for Nietzsche's revolutionary insight, that true strength might not involve better defenses against vulnerability, but greater capacity to remain open even in vulnerability. That freedom might not come through asserting the ego's will against life, but through temporarily transcending the ego's separated position, that the self we so carefully defend might be not our deepest truth but our fundamental constraint. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche expresses this insight through his prophet's declaration: one must still have chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star. This isn't glorification of disorder, but recognition that creativity, whether artistic, philosophical, or psychological, requires suspension of the controlling consciousness that maintains rigid boundaries between self and world. The chaos isn't random disintegration, but the fluid potentiality that exists before the ego's defensive structures impose fixed form. This understanding appears throughout Nietzsche's mature work, though often masked by language that can seem contradictory to casual readers. His concept of the will to power, frequently misunderstood as mere domination, actually refers to the creative force that emerges when consciousness isn't confined to the ego's defensive position. His vision of the Übermensch, or overhuman, isn't about superiority over others, but about transcendence of the limited self that most humans remain trapped within. His notorious declaration that God is dead isn't simply atheistic rejection, but recognition that genuine spiritual experience requires abandonment of metaphysical constructs that the ego creates to maintain its illusory position of separation and control. What distinguishes Nietzsche's insight from conventional self-help wisdom is his recognition that ego transcendence isn't achieved through better techniques of control, but through fundamental shift in relationship with existence. It doesn't come from strengthening the self's position, but from recognizing that the defended self is itself the limitation. As he writes in Beyond Good and Evil, the thought of suicide is a powerful comfort. It helps one through many a dreadful night. This isn't advocacy for self-destruction, but acknowledgement that freedom from suffering may require radical willingness to let go of the very self we've been taught to defend at all costs. In his personal notebooks from this period, Nietzsche articulates the core of this insight. My formula for greatness in a human being is amor fati, love of fate. Not wanting anything to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity, not merely to endure what happens of necessity, but to love it. This isn't passive resignation, but active embrace. Not better defense against life's challenges, but complete openness to them, even in their difficulty. The freedom Nietzsche discovers isn't control over circumstances, but liberation from the need for control itself. Have you ever experienced moments when, faced with circumstances you couldn't control, you discovered an unexpected freedom in surrender? When letting go of resistance revealed a form of strength different from but more profound than the power of defense. When temporary suspension of the ego's protective stance opened access to dimensions of experience that control had rendered inaccessible. Nietzsche's investigation into ego transcendence began with careful observation of how different approaches to existence manifest in human experience. Through both historical analysis and psychological insight, he identified a pattern that contradicted conventional wisdom. Those who focus most intently on strengthening and defending the ego often experience diminishing freedom, while those who develop capacity to temporarily transcend ego-centered perspective access forms of liberation that defensive strategies cannot provide. In The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche explores this pattern through his analysis of ancient Greek culture. He contrasts the Apollonian orientation, characterized by clear boundaries, rational order, and maintenance of individual identity, with the Dionysian impulse toward ecstatic dissolution of separate selfhood. What's striking in his analysis is that he doesn't simply favor one over the other, but recognizes their complementary relationship. The highest achievements of Greek civilization, he argues, emerged not from rigid adherence to Apollonian individuation, but from the creative tension between boundary and boundlessness, between form and flow, between the principle that maintains separate selfhood and that which temporarily dissolves it. This historical observation finds parallel in Nietzsche's psychological insights. In Human, All Too Human, he examines how excessive focus on self-protection generates what he calls ressentiment, a state of chronic reactivity where consciousness becomes increasingly dominated by what it opposes. The person who organizes existence around defending against threat becomes paradoxically defined by that threat, their experience narrowing to the very dangers they seek to avoid. Meanwhile, those who maintain a certain porousness, an ability to engage life without rigid defense, develop what Nietzsche calls the great health, a resilience characterized not by imperviousness, but by regenerative capacity. Perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from Nietzsche's analysis of creative experience. In The Gay Science, he explores how artistic inspiration involves temporary suspension of the controlling ego. One is merely incarnation, merely mouthpiece, merely medium of overwhelming forces. This isn't mystical exaggeration, but precise description of how creative breakthrough requires letting go of the defended position from which we ordinarily engage existence. The artist's liberation comes not from asserting the ego's will, but from temporarily transcending the ego's separated stance. Similar patterns emerge in Nietzsche's examination of other domains. In his analysis of morality, he shows how conventional ethical systems often function as sophisticated forms of self-defense, protecting the ego from confrontation with life's more challenging dimensions. In his critique of religion, he distinguishes between institutionalized faith, which typically reinforces ego boundaries through abstract belief, and direct spiritual experience, which often involves temporary dissolution of those boundaries. In his psychological observations, he notes how excessive self-consciousness, continuous monitoring of how we appear to others, creates a prison more confining than external constraint. These diverse manifestations of the same pattern led Nietzsche to a revolutionary understanding. What we call self isn't our deepest reality, but a construct we create and then defend against dissolution. This defense, while necessary for certain forms of functioning, becomes increasingly limiting when mistaken for fundamental truth. As he writes in Beyond Good and Evil, the subject is not something given. It is something added and invented and projected behind what there is. The freedom we associate with stronger selfhood may actually be a subtle form of bondage. The endless labor of maintaining boundaries that, while providing certain forms of security, simultaneously prevent access to life's deeper dimensions. This insight finds expression in Nietzsche's concept of self-overcoming, Selbstüberwindung, which appears throughout his mature work. This isn't self-improvement in the conventional sense of strengthening the ego's position, but the ego's capacity to temporarily transcend its own boundaries, to participate in dimensions of experience that exist beyond the defended stance of separate selfhood. As he expresses in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, I love him who wants to create beyond himself and thus perishes. This perishing isn't literal death, but the ego's willingness to risk its bounded integrity for the sake of creative engagement with existence. Nietzsche's personal journals reveal how directly this insight emerged from his own experience. His chronic illness forced confrontation with forms of vulnerability that conventional ego defenses couldn't protect against. Rather than responding with intensified resistance, he developed a different approach, one based not on defending against limitation, but on creatively engaging with it. This wasn't passive acceptance, but active embrace, not resignation to suffering, but transformation of relationship with it. As he writes in a note from 1887, from the Military School of Life, what does not kill me makes me stronger. This famous line isn't bravado, but recognition that strength emerges not from successful defense against difficulty, but from capacity to remain open even in difficulty. Have you noticed in your own experience how excessive focus on self-protection often creates its own form of confinement? How the boundaries we build to defend against vulnerability can become the very walls of our prison? How moments of genuine freedom typically involve not stronger assertion of the ego's will, but temporary suspension of the ego's defended position? As Nietzsche deepened his investigation into ego transcendence, he encountered a profound question. If our conventional understanding of strength and freedom is fundamentally backward, if true liberation comes not through better defense of the ego, but through its temporary transcendence, why do we remain so deeply invested in self-protective strategies that ultimately constrain us? This inquiry led him to identify specific psychological and cultural patterns that maintain our attachment to the defended ego despite its limitations. In On the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche explores how certain moral frameworks systematically reinforce ego identification by designating all impulses toward dissolution of boundaries as dangerous or evil. He analyzes how Christianity in particular transformed the Greek celebration of ecstatic states into condemnation of temptation, reframing the temporary suspension of separate selfhood not as liberation, but as spiritual danger. Christianity gave Eros poison to drink. He did not die of it, certainly, but degenerated into vice. This isn't criticism of sexual morality specifically, but recognition of how religious frameworks often demonize precisely those experiences: intense passion, creative abandon, mystical dissolution, that temporarily transcend the ego's bounded position. This insight led Nietzsche to recognize how specific cultural forms institutionalize attachment to the defended ego. In The Antichrist, he examines how religious institutions, while claiming to promote self-transcendence, often actually reinforce identification with separate selfhood. Christianity wants to make people sick. The church needs sick people. This isn't simplistic anti-religious polemic, but recognition of how spiritual frameworks that begin as pathways beyond the limited self frequently become sophisticated mechanisms for maintaining that limitation, converting the direct experience of boundary dissolution into abstract beliefs that the ego can safely hold without threatening its position. The pattern extends beyond religion into all cultural domains. In Human, All Too Human, Nietzsche analyzes how educational systems train students to value forms of knowledge that maintain the ego's controlling stance while devaluing experiences that temporarily transcend it. In his cultural criticism, he shows how social norms often pathologize states of consciousness, from intense emotion to creative absorption to contemplative dissolution, that threaten the bounded self. Even philosophy itself, he argues, in Beyond Good and Evil, typically reinforces ego attachment by framing truth as abstract concept that consciousness can possess rather than direct experience that may require suspension of the possessing stance. What makes these patterns particularly powerful is how they become internalized in our psychology. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche explores how the spirit of gravity, an orientation toward life characterized by excessive seriousness, rigid consistency, and continuous self-reference, weighs down consciousness. And when I saw my devil, I found him serious, thorough, profound, solemn. He was the spirit of gravity. Through him, all things fall. This gravity isn't merely external imposition, but our own psychological tendency to identify with the bounded self as ultimate reality, to mistake the ego's defensive position for our deepest truth. The result of these combined forces, moral, cultural, psychological, is what Nietzsche diagnosed as the camel stage of consciousness, a mode of being that willingly bears the weight of rigid identity, that values security over freedom, that accepts limitation as virtue. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he describes this as the first metamorphosis of spirit. What is heavy? So asks the weight-bearing spirit. Then it kneels down like the camel and wants to be well loaded. This isn't mere criticism, but recognition of a necessary developmental stage, one that, while providing certain forms of stability and function, ultimately becomes limiting when mistaken for the final truth of human possibility. These insights led Nietzsche to a revolutionary understanding. Liberation from the confined perspective of defended selfhood isn't achieved through better techniques of control, but through transformation of our relationship with control itself. It requires what he calls the lion stage of consciousness, the courage to question values that reinforce attachment to the bounded ego, to say no to frameworks that constrain freedom in the name of security. But even this negation is only intermediate step toward what he calls the child stage, a mode of being characterized not by rigid defense, nor by mere rebellion, but by creative engagement with existence from beyond the ego's bounded perspective. In his personal notebooks, Nietzsche expresses this understanding through his concept of the free spirit, Freigeist, not someone who simply rejects conventional morality, but who develops capacity to move fluidly between different value perspectives, who isn't confined to a single defended position. This freedom doesn't come from absence of structure, but from recognition that all structures are provisional rather than absolute, tools for creative engagement rather than final truths to be defended at all costs. As he writes in The Gay Science, we want to be the poets of our lives, first of all in the smallest, most everyday matters. Have you recognized in your own experience how various cultural frameworks, religious, educational, social, often reinforce identification with the bounded ego while pathologizing experiences that temporarily transcend it? How even frameworks that claim to promote freedom frequently constrain it by reinforcing attachment to defensive positions that ultimately limit our engagement with life's full dimensions? As Nietzsche continued his exploration, a profound pattern began to emerge, one that connected individual psychology with cultural evolution, spiritual insight with creative experience. This pattern revealed something remarkable. The defended ego isn't our deepest reality, but a developmental stage, a necessary structure that, while providing certain forms of stability and function, ultimately becomes limiting when mistaken for our final truth. The path to greater freedom involves not strengthening this structure, but developing capacity to temporarily transcend it. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche articulates this pattern through the metaphor of three metamorphoses of the spirit: the transformation from camel, bearing the weight of convention, to lion, questioning established values, to child, creating new values from beyond the ego's bounded perspective. This sequence isn't merely individual development, but pattern that appears across domains. In psychological growth, cultural evolution, creative process, and spiritual transformation. In each case, genuine freedom emerges not from better defenses of the separate self, but from capacity to access dimensions of experience beyond that separated stance. What makes this pattern particularly significant is how it resolves apparent contradictions in human experience. We often notice that increased control frequently leads to diminished aliveness, that stronger boundaries can create greater isolation, that rigid consistency often prevents authentic engagement. From Nietzsche's perspective, these aren't paradoxes, but predictable outcomes of a fundamental confusion, mistaking the ego's defensive position for our deepest identity. If freedom isn't found in strengthening this position, but in developing fluidity beyond it, then the sophisticated self-protective mechanisms we've been taught to value may actually be the primary obstacles to the liberation we seek. This understanding transforms how we view psychological development. Conventional frameworks typically measure growth by the ego's increasing ability to maintain control, establish boundaries, and defend against vulnerability. But if the ego itself is transitional structure rather than final reality, then genuine maturation would involve not just strengthened selfhood, but capacity to move beyond exclusive identification with that self, to access perspectives where rigid boundaries between subject and object, self and other, temporarily dissolve. As Nietzsche writes in Beyond Good and Evil, the noble soul has reverence for itself, not meaning narcissistic self-aggrandizement, but respect for dimensions of self-experience that transcend the ego's defensive stance. The pattern appears in cultural evolution as well. Nietzsche observes how civilizations typically begin with celebration of experiences that temporarily dissolve individual boundaries through ritual, festival, communal celebration, but gradually develop frameworks that increasingly confine consciousness to the ego's separated position. This isn't simple degeneration, but necessary stage in collective development, the establishment of stable identity that provides foundation for certain forms of function and achievement. The limitation comes when this stage is mistaken for final truth, when frameworks that confine consciousness to the bounded ego are treated as absolute rather than provisional. As he writes in The Birth of Tragedy, it is only as an aesthetic phenomenon that existence and the world are eternally justified, meaning that life's deepest value isn't found in fixed meanings the ego can possess, but in creative engagement that may require temporary suspension of the possessing stance itself. Perhaps most significantly, this pattern transforms our understanding of spiritual development. Traditional paths typically present two seemingly contradictory approaches, either strengthening the self through moral discipline and conceptual understanding, or dissolving the self through mystical practice and direct experience. Nietzsche's insight suggests these aren't opposing paths, but complementary phases. The ego must develop sufficient strength and stability before it can safely experience temporary transcendence. Mystical dissolution without prior individuation produces not liberation, but regression. True spiritual maturity involves not choosing one approach over the other, but integrating both, developing capacity to move fluidly between the bounded perspective necessary for certain forms of functioning and the boundless perspective that reveals dimensions of reality the bounded stance cannot access. This integration appears in Nietzsche's concept of the dancing star that emerges from creative chaos, not random dissolution of structure, but transformation, where existing structures become material for new creation rather than fixed positions to be rigidly maintained. The star isn't formless, but possesses what he calls style, coherence that emerges not from rigid control, but from organic integration. As he writes in The Gay Science, one thing is needful, to give style to one's character, a great and rare art. This style isn't imposed from without, but emerges from within. Not mechanical consistency, but organic integrity. Not rigid defense of boundaries, but creative engagement that transcends while including the bounded perspective. What makes this pattern particularly revolutionary is how it transforms our understanding of freedom itself. If liberation isn't found in the ego's assertion of will, but in developing capacity to temporarily transcend the ego's bounded perspective, then freedom isn't primarily about control, but about relationship, not domination of circumstances, but creative engagement with them from a stance not confined to rigid self-defense. As Nietzsche expresses through Zarathustra, I say unto you, one must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star. The chaos isn't random disorder, but the fluid potentiality accessed when consciousness isn't confined to the ego's defensive position, the creative force that emerges when we engage life from beyond the rigid boundaries of separate selfhood. Have you recognized in your own development how certain forms of growth involve not just strengthened ego, but capacity to temporarily transcend exclusive identification with that ego? How experiences that briefly dissolve rigid boundaries between self and world, whether through creative flow, loving connection, or contemplative awareness, often provide access to dimensions of reality that the defended stance cannot perceive? The implications of Nietzsche's insight into ego transcendence extend far beyond abstract philosophy, transforming our understanding of freedom, fulfillment, creativity, and even the meaning of existence itself. If he's right, that liberation comes not through better defense of the separate self, but through developing capacity to temporarily transcend that self, then many of our fundamental assumptions about human development and potential require radical reconsideration. First, this perspective revolutionizes our understanding of freedom. Conventional frameworks typically equate liberty with the ego's increasing ability to control circumstances, to assert its will, to maintain boundaries against external influence. But if the ego itself is transitional structure rather than final reality, then genuine freedom wouldn't be found in strengthening its position, but in developing fluidity beyond exclusive identification with that position. As Nietzsche writes in Twilight of the Idols, freedom is the will to be responsible for ourselves. It is to preserve the distance which separates us from other men, to grow more indifferent to hardship, to severity, to privation, and even to life itself. This isn't glorification of suffering, but recognition that true liberation involves independence from the ego's continuous need for comfort and security. Freedom, not from external constraint, but from internal compulsion to maintain the bounded self at all costs. This reframing resolves the paradox many experience between control and aliveness. We often notice that increased mastery frequently leads to decreased vitality, that perfect execution can produce diminished joy, that rigid consistency often prevents authentic engagement. From Nietzsche's perspective, these aren't contradictions, but predictable outcomes of a fundamental confusion, mistaking the ego's defensive position for our deepest identity. If freedom isn't found in strengthening this position but in developing capacity for fluid movement beyond it, then the sophisticated control mechanisms we've been taught to value may actually be the primary obstacles to the liberation we seek. Second, this insight transforms our understanding of fulfillment. Traditional frameworks typically locate satisfaction either in achieving future goals or in conforming to established values, both orientations that reinforce identification with the bounded ego. But if our deepest reality transcends this bounded perspective, then authentic fulfillment wouldn't be found in what the separate self might eventually attain or become, but in experiences that temporarily dissolve the boundaries of that separate self. As Nietzsche expresses in The Gay Science, "What is all the joy I seek? It is only a mask. What is all my work? Only to say what I am, what I mean." True joy isn't future achievement, but present authenticity, the expression of dimensions beyond the ego's defended stance. This understanding appears in Nietzsche's concept of amor fati, love of fate, which represents not passive resignation, but active embrace of existence from beyond the ego's continuous evaluation and resistance. In Exe Homo, he describes this as my formula for greatness in a human being, not wanting anything to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity. This isn't denial of improvement, but recognition that authentic fulfillment isn't found in the ego's endless project of comparing actual with ideal, but in direct engagement with reality from beyond that comparing stance. Third, this perspective radically reframes creativity. Conventional approaches often present creative achievement as expression of the individual ego, the separate self-producing works that reflect its unique vision or perspective. But if our deepest nature transcends the bounded ego, then authentic creation wouldn't involve stronger assertion of separate selfhood, but temporary dissolution of the boundaries that maintain that separation. As Nietzsche writes in The Birth of Tragedy, in song and in dance, man expresses himself as a member of a higher community. He has forgotten how to walk and speak, and is on the way toward flying into the air, dancing. This isn't mystical metaphor, but precise description of creative states where the usual boundaries between self and world temporarily dissolve, allowing access to dimensions of reality the bounded perspective cannot perceive. This creative understanding extends beyond conventional arts into all domains of human activity. In The Will to Power, Nietzsche explores how even scientific discovery involves temporary suspension of the ego's controlling stance. There is only a perspective seeing, only a perspective knowing, and the more effects we allow to speak about one thing, the more eyes, different eyes, we can use to observe one thing, the more complete will our concept of this thing, our objectivity, be. True objectivity isn't found in rigid detachment, but in capacity to perceive from multiple perspectives, a fluidity that requires temporary transcendence of exclusive identification with any single perspective, including that of the bounded ego. Perhaps most profoundly, this insight transforms our understanding of existence's meaning. If our deepest reality transcends the separate self, then meaning isn't something the ego discovers or creates, but dimension it temporarily accesses when rigid boundaries between subject and object, self and world, momentarily dissolve. As Nietzsche expresses through Zarathustra, "Remain faithful to the earth, my brothers, with the power of your virtue. Let your gift-giving love and your knowledge serve the meaning of the earth." This isn't materialistic rejection of transcendence, but recognition that genuine meaning isn't found in abstract frameworks the ego constructs to maintain its separated position, but in direct engagement with reality from beyond that separated stance. Have you experienced moments where you've temporarily transcended the bounded perspective of separate selfhood, perhaps in creative flow, loving connection, natural beauty, or contemplative awareness, and discovered forms of freedom, fulfillment, and meaning that the ego's defensive position cannot access? Have you glimpsed dimensions of reality that become visible only when the usual boundaries between self and world momentarily dissolve? If Nietzsche's insight about ego transcendence is so liberating, why hasn't it transformed our understanding of freedom and fulfillment? Why do we remain fixated on strengthening and defending the separate self, despite the limitations this approach ultimately creates? Nietzsche identified powerful, systemic forces that maintain our attachment to the bounded ego, not through conscious conspiracy, but through institutional and psychological patterns that perpetuate identification with separate selfhood, despite its constraints. Religious institutions have been perhaps the most obvious force reinforcing ego attachment, despite claiming to promote its transcendence. In The Antichrist, Nietzsche analyzes how Christianity in particular transformed direct spiritual experience, which often involves temporary dissolution of the boundaries between self and world, into abstract beliefs and moral codes that the ego can safely hold without threatening its position. What is bad? Everything that stems from weakness. By this he means not physical limitation, but the psychological weakness that requires constant defense of the bounded self, that fears the vulnerability that comes with temporary transcendence of that bounded perspective. Religious frameworks that begin as pathways beyond the limited ego frequently become sophisticated mechanisms for maintaining that limitation, converting the immediate experience of boundary dissolution into conceptual systems that reinforce rather than transcend separation. This pattern extends beyond traditional religions to secular institutions that similarly profit from maintaining identification with the bounded ego. Educational systems typically reward forms of knowledge that reinforce the controlling stance of separate selfhood while pathologizing experiences that temporarily transcend it. Economic structures motivate through appeal to the ego's fear and desire, its continuous sense of lack that must be filled through future acquisition. Political frameworks mobilize through strengthening rather than transcending boundaries between self and other, us and them, reinforcing the very separations that genuine freedom might require us to temporarily dissolve. What makes these patterns particularly powerful is how they align with psychological tendencies that Nietzsche identified as fundamental to human development. On the genealogy of morals, he explores how consciousness itself evolved primarily as self-regulatory function, the internalization of external authority that creates the divided self capable of self-restraint. This division, while generating certain evolutionary advantages, necessarily separates us from the wholeness of direct experience. The bad conscience that results isn't accidental byproduct, but essential mechanism of social development, one that both enables civilization and prevents the complete presence that would reveal dimensions beyond the ego's bounded perspective. Nietzsche's notebooks reveal his awareness of how threatening his insight was to established power structures. In a note from 1887, he writes, "My philosophy brings the triumphant idea of which all other modes of thought will ultimately perish." This isn't grandiosity, but recognition that genuine liberation from exclusive identification with the bounded ego represents radical threat to systems of control that function precisely by maintaining that identification. A humanity capable of fluid movement beyond the perspective of separate selfhood would be ungovernable by external authority because it would recognize dimensions of reality that the ego-centered stance cannot perceive. The result of these combined forces, institutional and psychological, is what Nietzsche diagnosed as the last man mentality, a mode of existence focused entirely on comfort, security, and avoidance of all risk. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he describes this condition. No shepherd and one herd. Everybody wants the same. Everybody is the same. Whoever feels different goes voluntarily into a madhouse. This isn't mere cultural criticism, but recognition of how completely identification with the bounded ego can constrain human possibility, reducing the vast potential of consciousness to the narrow project of maintaining separate selfhood at all costs. These insights led Nietzsche to recognize that liberation from exclusive identification with the bounded ego isn't achieved through simple techniques or practices, but through fundamental transformation in relationship with existence itself.
It requires what he calls the transvaluation of all values, not just questioning specific beliefs, but transforming the very stance from which value is perceived, developing capacity to access perspectives beyond the ego's continuous evaluation based on its own comfort and security.
This isn't rejection of value, but recognition that our deepest values may emerge not from the bounded ego's defensive position, but from dimensions of reality that become visible only when that bounded perspective is temporarily transcended. Have you noticed how various cultural frameworks, educational, economic, political, even spiritual, often reinforce identification with the bounded ego rather than facilitating its temporary transcendence? How systems that claim to promote freedom frequently constrain it by maintaining attachment to the very self-protective stance that ultimately limits our experience of life's deeper dimensions. If Nietzsche's insight about ego transcendence is as liberating as it appears, why has it been consistently misunderstood, marginalized, or actively suppressed? The answers reveal how profoundly threatening this understanding is to established frameworks of meaning, systems of authority, and our own psychological defenses. First, Nietzsche's vision fundamentally threatens traditional religious and moral systems by suggesting that freedom comes not through strengthening the ego's adherence to fixed principles, but through temporarily transcending the bounded perspective from which those principles appear absolute. Nietzsche undermines the entire foundation of conventional ethics. His famous declaration that God is dead isn't simply atheistic rejection, but recognition that genuine spiritual experience requires abandonment of fixed frameworks that the ego creates to maintain its illusory position of separation and control. This perspective doesn't merely modify religious understanding, but renders obsolete the entire project of securing the bounded self through adherence to absolute moral codes. This explains why religious interpretations of Nietzsche have consistently distorted his thought, casting him as merely destructive, the philosopher who proclaimed the death of God without offering an alternative. But this caricature misses his actual position. As he writes in The Gay Science, God is dead, but given the way of men, there may still be caves for thousands of years in which his shadow will be shown. Nietzsche wasn't simply negating traditional morality, but pointing toward a more profound ethical orientation, one based not on rigid adherence to fixed principles, but on creative engagement from beyond the ego's defensive stance. This vision threatens not just specific moral frameworks, but the very project of securing separate selfhood through absolute values. Second, Nietzsche's insight threatens established power structures that derive authority from maintaining identification with the bounded ego. Political systems, educational institutions, economic frameworks all depend on consciousness remaining confined to the perspective of separate selfhood, where security appears more valuable than freedom, where comfort takes priority over truth, where the ego's fear of vulnerability prevents access to dimensions beyond its control. A humanity capable of fluid movement beyond exclusive identification with the bounded self would be ungovernable through conventional means, because it would recognize that its deepest reality transcends the very fears and desires through which external authority typically maintains control. Nietzsche experienced this institutional resistance firsthand. His works were largely ignored by the academic establishment during his lifetime, and when they gained attention after his death, they were often selectively interpreted to neutralize their most revolutionary aspects. His vision of liberation through transcendence of the bounded ego was typically reduced to mere individualism, strengthening rather than transcending separate selfhood, or to nihilistic rejection of all value rather than access to deeper values from beyond the ego's defensive stance. These misinterpretations serve to contain his thought within existing frameworks rather than allowing it to transform those frameworks as he intended. Third, and perhaps most significantly, Nietzsche's perspective challenges our psychological attachment to the bounded ego. If the self we so carefully defend isn't our deepest reality but transitional structure, necessary for certain forms of functioning but ultimately limiting when mistaken for final truth, then many of our most basic assumptions about identity, security, and fulfillment require radical reconsideration. This recognition threatens not just our beliefs, but our very sense of who we are, the continuous project of maintaining separate selfhood that constitutes most people's primary psychological activity. This psychological resistance explains why even those who intellectually understand the importance of ego transcendence rarely transform their actual orientation toward existence. The patterns of self-protection that Nietzsche identified, continuous evaluation based on the ego's comfort and security, rigid adherence to fixed identity, fear of vulnerability that prevents authentic engagement, aren't just habits, but defenses against the uncertainty that comes with fluid movement beyond exclusive identification with the bounded self. To transcend attachment to separate selfhood means confronting existential insecurities that most people spend their entire lives trying to avoid, a form of psychological courage that many find too demanding to sustain. Nietzsche's personal writings reveal his awareness of how threatening his insight would be, not just to institutions, but to individuals' psychological comfort. In a note from 1887, he writes, "There is the instinct of the herd against those who are independent and different. There is the hatred of the mediocre against the exceptional." He understood that his affirmation of fluid movement beyond the bounded ego would be resisted, not because it's incomprehensible, but because it's too comprehensible. It reveals possibilities of freedom beyond separate selfhood that many find more threatening than the constraints of that selfhood's defensive position. What makes this resistance particularly ironic is that the experience Nietzsche points toward isn't foreign to human consciousness, but one of its most fundamental capacities. Children naturally access perspectives beyond rigid self-reference before being trained in exclusive identification with the bounded ego. Artists experience creative states where the usual boundaries between self and world temporarily dissolve. Even in ordinary life, moments of unexpected beauty or crisis often thrust us beyond habitual self-protection into direct engagement with reality. Ego transcendence isn't esoteric achievement, but natural capacity. one we're systematically trained to suppress through psychological and cultural patterns that, while serving certain functions, ultimately separate us from dimensions of existence the bounded self cannot access. Have you noticed how difficult it is to maintain awareness of perspectives beyond the ego's defensive stance, even when you intellectually understand their value? How various psychological mechanisms, continuous self-evaluation, rigid attachment to identity, fear of vulnerability, pull consciousness back to exclusive identification with the bounded self. How these patterns function not just as mental habits, but as defenses against the uncertainty that comes with fluid movement beyond that bounded perspective. The final question isn't whether Nietzsche was right about ego transcendence. The evidence increasingly suggests he glimpsed something profound about human freedom and potential. The question is what it means to live as if this understanding were true. How would our existence transform if we recognized that liberation comes not through better defense of the separate self, but through developing capacity to temporarily transcend that self, to access dimensions of reality that become visible only when the usual boundaries between subject and object, self and world, momentarily dissolve? The transformation begins with a fundamental shift in orientation. Instead of measuring growth by the ego's increasing ability to maintain control, establish boundaries, and defend against vulnerability, we might recognize development as involving both strengthened selfhood and capacity to move beyond exclusive identification with that self. As Nietzsche writes in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, man is a rope stretched between animal and superman, a rope over an abyss. What is great in man is that he is a bridge and not a goal. This isn't rejection of the bounded ego, but recognition of its transitional nature, a necessary structure for certain forms of functioning that becomes limiting when mistaken for our final truth. This reorientation doesn't mean abandoning practical responsibilities or external achievements. Rather, it transforms our relationship with them. We pursue particular goals, not as sources of ultimate fulfillment, but as contexts for developing both individual capacity and ability to temporarily transcend individuated perspective. The value isn't in future attainment, but in present engagement that integrates rather than separates, that connects rather than divides, that creates from beyond the ego's continuous self-protection. The artist creates not just to produce works, but to access states where the usual boundaries between self and world temporarily dissolve. The scientist discovers not just to accumulate knowledge, but to participate in dimensions of reality the bounded ego cannot perceive on its own. Each endeavor becomes not means to distant end, but opportunity for present transcendence. Perhaps most profoundly, this perspective transforms our relationship with vulnerability. Rather than measuring strength by successful defense against life's unpredictability, limitation, and impermanence, we might recognize that genuine power involves capacity to remain open even in vulnerability, to engage existence without the rigid self-protection that ultimately constrains us more than it secures. As Nietzsche expresses in The Gay Science, the secret for harvesting from existence the greatest fruitfulness and the greatest enjoyment is to live dangerously. This isn't recklessness, but recognition that authentic freedom requires willingness to risk the ego's bounded security for the sake of accessing dimensions beyond its defensive position. This approach doesn't promise continuous transcendence. Moments where consciousness moves beyond exclusive identification with the bounded self are typically temporary, as they should be given the practical necessity of individuated functioning in many contexts. The mature relationship isn't permanent dissolution of ego boundaries, but fluid movement between the bounded perspective necessary for certain forms of engagement and the boundless perspective that reveals aspects of reality the bounded stance cannot access. As Nietzsche writes in Beyond Good and Evil, he who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster. And if you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you. This isn't warning against transcendence, but recognition of the need for integration, developing capacity to move between different dimensions of consciousness without becoming trapped in either rigid boundary or formless dissolution. If this perspective resonates with your experience, you've likely already glimpsed the liberation Nietzsche describes. in moments of creative flow, loving connection, natural beauty, or contemplative awareness where the usual boundaries between self and world temporarily dissolve. These aren't departures from reality, but glimpses of its deeper dimensions, aspects that become visible only when consciousness isn't confined to the ego's defensive position, when we engage existence from beyond the continuous project of maintaining separate selfhood at all costs. This isn't a path for everyone. As Nietzsche acknowledges in Beyond Good and Evil, there is noble self-determination in a nature that says, I will have no goals that I cannot set for myself, or that I cannot reach by my own powers. This noble self-determination involves not just strengthened individuality, but willingness to risk that individuality for the sake of experiencing dimensions beyond individuated perspective, a form of existential courage that some may not yet be ready to embody. But for those who recognize themselves in this vision, it offers not just philosophical perspective, but practical approach to living that aligns with our deepest potential. The invitation isn't to abandon the bounded ego, which serves necessary functions in many contexts, but to recognize it as transitional rather than final, as partial perspective rather than complete truth. To develop capacity for fluid movement between different dimensions of consciousness, between the separated stance that distinguishes and the connected stance that integrates, between form and flow, between being and becoming. Not rigid consistency, but creative integrity. Not perfect defense, but perfect engagement. Not control over life, but participation within it from beyond the controlling position itself. As Nietzsche writes in The Will to Power, and do you know what the world is to me? This world, a monster of energy, without beginning, without end. This world is the will to power, and nothing besides. And you yourselves are also this will to power, and nothing besides. Have you begun to recognize that what you've been defending might be the very thing preventing you from experiencing the freedom you truly seek? That the armor you've built to protect yourself might be the prison that keeps you from feeling fully alive?